is that I'm going to talk for about 10-15 minutes, just a bit on my experience, and then just really opening up for either questions, either to me or to each other, or any form of discussion. Just in relation to my background, I was a police officer for 31 years in the northwest of England. But for the last 10 to 15 years of that, I was intrinsically involved in developing restorative justice, particularly for the police force, but also with the Ministry of Justice. It's not something I continue to practice. There are other people on this call today who are practicing restorative justice practitioners. So if some of my language and some of my concepts are a little bit out of kilter, then I'm sure you'll all correct me. But the whole point of today was just to generate some discussion. And I'm just simply going to talk about my journey for restorative justice, how I got there, and what happened with that journey. So I've done some slides. I'm just going to share the screen, so you'll hopefully be able to see it. Okay. Share. Okay, does everyone see those okay? That's good.
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna start off with something which I use a lot, which is the whole principle of why policing exists, and we're based on a number of principles that were written by the Home Secretary at the time, Robert Peel, and the one Peelian principle, which I go back to time and time again in my career as a police officer, is the one that's on the screen. I'm not going to read it out, but most of you will know it. It's about the police being the public and the public being the police. And for me, that principle of policing is something that drove me throughout my policing career, and something that I feel is vitally important, but quite often was forgotten. As policing became more professional, as policing became more, I suppose, committed to science, it often lost that relationship. And it's something I fought hard to keep and continue to work with. My journey towards restorative justice probably started in the early 2000s. Some of you will remember, if you were in the criminal justice agencies and at the time, was that there was a real drive in around about 2002, 2003 to increase what came known as sanction detections, or offences brought to justice. And the government drove police forces to improving their performance. And I remember that my chief constable at the time, a guy called Mike Todd, sadly departed, came to see me as I was a divisional commander in Greater Manchester, and said to me, and I remember these words enriched on my heart. He said, "Garry, your job is to reduce crime and bring people more to justice. Anything else is a luxury you can't afford." And what he was referring to was what I was committed to do, which was community engagement, working with problem solving, trying to get communities to work together. And effectively what he was saying was that the theory of policing in Greater Manchester at the time didn't involve community. It was about police driving up performance. So I decided that day to leave Greater Manchester, and I took a job in Cheshire. And I remember getting to Cheshire and finding that in the 12 months prior to my arrival, that there'd been a 40% increase in detections, but incredibly, there'd been a 100% increase in the number of young people brought into the criminal justice system. And there for me was the fallacy of the whole drive for detections, that it was, and the phrase often used was low-hanging fruit. The police force was targeting young people who could easily get detections from to drive up their sanction detection. There was not more burglars being brought to justice in any way. And I began to look around, and I remembered when I was doing my master's at Cambridge in 2003, coming across the concept of reintegrative shaming by Braithwaite. And I remember that drove me to start asking the questions around how restorative justice was being used across the world. And I ended up going across to Northern Ireland and being really inspired by community restorative justice over in Northern Ireland, who a lot of the community didn't have trust in policing, but still wanted justice in relation to crime. And a lot of the justice was delivered through restorative organisations, and it was really community driven. And I was really inspired by that. And I came back to the UK and started looking around, and I met my picture in the top right-hand corner there, Peter Wolfe, and Peter's on this call. Met Peter Wolfe, who I suppose really nailed it for me in terms of inspiration. Peter's experience was that he was a criminal, but his experience of using restorative justice really changed his life. And I began to see that restorative justice was something that could be used within criminal justice far more. So I set out on a journey, and I worked with the Home Office and other police forces around the country, and began to introduce restorative programs into policing for the first time. And again, I'm not going to read through this slide, but for me, I suppose the key elements, the key principles of restorative justice. For me, that big question for restorative justice, it reintroduces communication and apology into our society. It begins to bring victims and offenders together in a way that they can have dialogue around what's happened and how feelings were hurt and what the impact of crimes were. And that introduction of dialogue and communication and apology is vital in terms of restorative justice. Because what it does, it gives an opportunity to be able to understand the harm that's actually caused within a community when crime happens. And something that really couldn't be done within the criminal justice system. And Peter used to tell me this phrase quite a lot, and he used to say that the victim of a crime is the most affected by that crime, but in the court process is probably the least involved. And that is I suppose, the fallacy of justice, and that justice was often done without the victim's, clear involvement. And what restorative justice did was it enabled us to reframe what justice meant to a community and be able to deal with, not just in terms of non-serious, your antisocial behaviours, your low-level criminality, but also to deal with serious crime in a way that put the victim at the centre of decision-making and allowed us to really sort of bring around communication. And I'm just going to cut more slides, but this for me is a really, and something that drove me in terms of a fantastic quote. And it talks about the power of dialogue. And often when we talk about crime in our societies, we often hear the sort of, the narrative is around the impact of crime, the danger it brings, or the destruction crime brings. And we use language that often sort of shreds communities' sort of relationships with each other, and it inflames emotions because we talk about crime in really negative terminology. And what restorative justice allows us to do is it uses dialogue around stories, emotions, community identities, why people commit crime, what happened in their lives, to be able to drive to that point, what happened to the victim. And that focuses more on healing and relationships than it does on destruction. And for me, that is what restorative justice for me is all about. It's about really focusing on the dialogue which brings about real healing within a society. And as I got towards the end of my journey in restorative justice and was thinking about how I'm going to move on from policing, for me, it was all about putting restorative justice firmly in the community, in the neighborhoods. And the reason that we did that is really trying to get communities to be train community members to become restorative justice coordinators, to be facilitators of really good restorative justice conferences, because it allows a wider group of people to be involved in the solutions. It gives opportunity for the community to actually get involved in the process of justice. And when I go back to that, my original sort of academic theory around restorative justice, that reintegrative shaming, you can't reintegrate an offender back into a community unless it's done in front of people. And that's why it's really important that restorative justice can be done actually within communities, because it has the supporters of the offender, but also the victim and those affected by it. And they all see that and begin to accept how we can bring about sort of improvement and change. So for me, restorative justice was very firmly, sort of entrenched within the whole question around how do you get more active citizens, how do you get more active communities to be able to understand crime, but also do something important with it. And that's how I began to then sort of move away from restorative justice and back into policing and back into the work I do now with Susan, in terms of trying to grow social capital and active citizenship in communities affected by crime. But restorative justice remains a principle that's really at my heart and something that's really important to me. And so for me, it was an opportunity today to talk about my journey, to talk about how, as a police officer committed to community, how they used some form of academic opportunity to be able to bring about a real change. And since I started, police forces up and down the country use restorative practice. There are communities all across the UK with strong restorative justice programs. The Home Office funded every single police and crime commissioner in terms of putting money into restorative practice. Over the last 15 years, we've seen a huge uptake and a huge change in the acceptance of restorative justice. I played a very small part in it. Peter played a much bigger part than I did. But it's something that I look back on in my policing career that I think I'm the proudest of. And the proudest element of being a police officer was the opportunity to be able to explore how to use restorative practice within the criminal justice system. So I'm going to leave it there. That's my introduction. That's my journey. That's who I am and why I did what I did. And I'll leave it to all of you to give your thoughts, your comments, ask any questions. And if there are people out there who are good restorative practitioners, then I'm sure you come to my aid and help me sort of keep this dialogue going. So I'll leave it there. I'll stop the share.
Thanks, Gary. Okay, so I'll facilitate just because there's quite a few of you on there. So I've muted you all just because there's loads of background noise in everybody's homes. If it's anything like mine, I've got a 2-year-old screaming around at the moment. So I'm going to put myself on mute in a minute. So to unmute yourselves, if you're not familiar, there's a mute button down in the left-hand corner. So as soon as you want to talk, if you use that, or if you've got a keyboard in front of you and you just want to say yes or no, you can hold the space bar down while you're talking, and when you lift it, it goes back on to mute. So there's a little tip for you if you're a regular Zoom user now. Gary, I've got one question I want to sort of open the conversation with, and that is, are there particular crimes that this approach works well with?
You know what, and again, I'll invite Peter to give his views as well, but there are some danger crimes. We often worked with the Ministry of Justice and the Home Office, and crimes such as domestic abuse, crimes where power were involved, were crimes that we often saw as red letters, and there was a real debate around, can you use restorative practice to deal with crimes where there's a real power imbalance? So there are certain crimes that you have to tread very carefully. But, as Peter will tell you, we've seen restorative practice used in murder cases. We've seen it used in, individuals with significant offending history. We've seen it being used at low-level crime, first offenders, particularly young people who perhaps haven't really fully understood the consequences of what they've done. So in the restorative world, there are no crimes that we don't use. And the impact, i.e., does it work well, is really about the quality of the conference and the quality of facilitation rather than the actual crime type. It can be used for anything, but it's about how committed individuals are to the process of restorative practice. I don't know whether Peter would agree with that. Peter?
Okay. In my time in being involved with restorative justice, I've seen the face-to-face meetings involve every crime you can possibly think of, ranging from theft from Sainsbury's all the way through to brutal rape, and all have been very effective. Is there a no-no? Probably when there's the fear of the re-victimization. That's obvious. That's an obvious thing. What I've always asked is, what is justice? This is the big thing for me, and what is justice? And time again, a judge at the Old Bailey or wherever, I say justice must be seen to be done. This is what I always say. I'm going to give you 10 years, 5 years, not thinking about whether or not the victim is satisfied with the outcome. And surely justice in society must be that the victim is satisfied with the outcome of the whole proceedings, not just the sentence, of the whole proceedings. As that victim had the questions of, usually a victim to a criminal or to a harmer is no more than an A4 piece of paper. and they're always the same. They're quite contrived. I left my home at 7 o'clock this morning. I locked and secured my premises, and I returned home to find the door window had been forced. And that's all it is. And for someone how I used to be, it was quite easy to justify myself to that A4 piece of paper. In fact, it was quite easy for me to slander that A4 piece of paper. Yeah, I could go on forever about this, but I won't. Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Right. This is for everyone, really. Anyone who's facilitated or witnessed an RJ face to face. Do you think that indicators can be taken from the dialogue used by the harmer, by the offender, as to whether or not the chance of reoffending has been reduced?
Can you repeat that again then for me, Peter?
Okay.
Do you think the indicators can be taken by the offender, from the offender?
Do you think that indicators can be taken from the dialogue that the offender uses in the face-to-face meeting, right, as to whether or not the chance of reoffending has been reduced? You know, it's easy to say sorry. That's the easy bit. But yeah, there's more to it than that.
Yeah. I mean, from my experience...
Sue wants to answer that, I think, Garry.
What?
Or ask a question, one of those, but she's definitely put her hand up.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's just a response to Peter, really. I think that I think the process really gives you the indicators as to whether or not kind of the harmer has any remorse. And then I think kind of so I manage a restorative justice service in Devon and Cornwall, so the process creates the opportunities for that to become apparent. And I think one of the things that we kind of assess is kind of, in order to proceed, is the kind of the conversation and the exploration of remorse. And I think you're absolutely right. I think it's really easy to say sorry, isn't it? And whether or not where that's coming from, the motivation for it or the lack of. But I think also we have within, when kind of the case is closed, we also have our feedback kind of facility, and that helps us evaluate. And we'll capture information such as that. So part of our evaluation overall with the service is around kind of reducing reoffending alongside other markers as well.
Thanks, Sue. Anyone else want to try and answer that? Yeah, Michael, you've got your hand up.
I didn't want to try and answer that because I wouldn't be able to. I just wanted to ask a question. But if someone wants to follow up with an answer to that other point, please go ahead first.
No, jump in with a question, Michael.
Well, I suppose, given I don't really know much about this, I'd like a bit more of an explanation about how it works, because the thing that struck me is, perhaps it's partly to do with Peter's question as well. I'm just thinking the victim, an individual is going to be angry, presumably, that they've been a victim of crime. And so and then a community might indeed be angry about the incident. So I suppose I'm not quite clear how the connection between the criminal, kind of apologising or whatever, the relationship with the victim as an individual, the local community, and then how it fits into the kind of wider system. Because all those different elements have a different motivation or something that they want to get out of it that's different. And I suppose, how do we get a kind of balance right across the system?
So there are a few people on here I know don't know the process either. So, because I saw a few nodding heads when you asked that, Michael. So who does this all the time or a bit involved in it, that wants to give us an indication of what the process looks like? Yeah, Sue is happy to do that. Thanks, Sue.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to share. I mean, I appreciate it's going to be different, with different services, but our service is commissioned by Police and Crime Commissioners for Devon and Cornwall, and it's delivered in partnership with a local charity called Shewan in Devon. So the process for us, and I'm going to probably for time be quite oversimplistic here, but there is a reported crime. The referral will come into maybe via the victim care unit, or the referral will come into the Restorative Justice coordinator within Devon and Cornwall Police. That then sort of, we kind of get the information collated and that's sent to our coordinator, who will look at the details of the crime. We'll allocate the case to one of our paid practitioners, because unusually we're a service that actually pays. We have a team of paid practitioners, and we have the service is then complemented with a team of volunteers from a kind of a case management point of view. From the referral from the coordinator, we will then have a conversation initially with the victim. So I guess from a restorative justice perspective, this is about giving a voice to the victim. I think as kind of, as Garry indicated before, although the victim is kind of the key person within kind of the crime, their needs and their voices often aren't heard or met. So we will touch base with the victim first of all to see whether or not they are happy to proceed, because actually the referral or the initial kind of instigation might come from the harmer, so from the offender themselves. So we have to come in, speak to the victim, speak to the harmed person, and double check that they're actually in agreement with taking the process forward. If the harmed person isn't in agreement, we don't proceed the case. And then kind of we just sort of, do whatever is required from a restorative process point of view to get to the point of, whether or not it's a face-to-face restorative conference. It might be shuttling, it might be through letters. We just kind of, that is agreed through the process, but at all times, if the victim is happy to proceed, we proceed. If they want to pull out and withdraw at any point, then we stop the case. Does that help?
Michael, could I just add to that as well, just in case there's any thoughts in your mind? Sometimes restorative justice is used as a process outside of the criminal justice system. So depending on the wishes of the victim, it might well be that a restorative conference takes place, and that is the way that the crime is therefore dealt with. Sometimes it's dealt with in addition to the criminal justice system. So the person, the offender, the harmer, might still go through the criminal justice process, but at the end of it, or even as part through it, might get involved in a restorative justice conference with the victim, either in some way to help the court understand the question around retribution or reparation required, or maybe at the end of the sentence or during the sentence, or perhaps a prison sentence, to allow to try and bring closure for the victim. So there are various routes in and different ways to do, and the skill of a facilitator is all about trying to identify how a restorative practice would be used best. The evidence is out there that what restorative justice allows you to do is reduce the frequency of reoffending. And that is the biggest powerful evidence that's out there. That, far more than any sentence or punishment that a court can impose, the biggest impact on reducing the level of reoffending within the UK today is where a good restorative practice takes place. That is the one thing that's going to have the biggest impact on levels of reoffending. It's not everyone's cup of tea. I spent probably 10 years fighting with the media, fighting with politicians around the concept of soft justice or letting people off the hook or whatever. The language is really difficult and political to be able to get your way through, but the evidence stares you in the face. If you want to reduce the frequency of reoffending in this country, then a good restorative conference is probably the best way to be able to do that. And I think the evidence is there to see, and I hope Sue would agree with that.
I guess I just wanted to add to that, the likes of the Restorative Justice Council, we have to deliver certain quality standards in order to deliver a service around restorative justice. So, it's not an easy service to deliver. It's certainly not an easy option for the offender, because actually it's quite a brave thing to do, to be, to have an outcome where you are face to face with the person that you've harmed through crime. And then I guess also coming back to, I think, a point Michael made earlier, is around that kind of the ripple of harm effect. So looking at actually, and I think kind of Garry mentioned this in his presentation, this bit about the impact of bringing the harmer back into the community and having everybody aware, not in a shaming kind of way. And that's how we reduce kind of reoffending as well. That's how we kind of raise awareness as to the impact of crime. So yeah, no, I just wanted to kind of pick up on that really as well, Garry. It's not.
Deb, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, I was kind of wondering about that last point you made, Sue, about the reaction of the people around the victim, so their family, their community, because the people, the kind of Daily Mail brigade out there, and it ripples out. How do you address that? Because I can understand how you can work with the victim and the perpetrator, but it's that hinterland, and then the perpetrator goes back, you know, if they're both of the same town, the same community, because often people, there are restriction orders, aren't there, on perpetrators, that they have to live somewhere else or keep X miles away from their victim. So how's that work?
Okay, so I guess that's the power of, I guess looking at the value of a proper, well thought out process. I think, as Peter said as well, something that doesn't re-victimize or sort of, add additional harm to the victim. It's about sort of, part of the conversations with each party around who else has been harmed and affected by this crime and how best can we support them. So sometimes the additionality is around how do we support those around those who've been affected by the crime, whether that's family, friends. We're dealing with a case at the moment where 2 young children were present in the house in a domestic abuse sort of situation, and it's about bringing the relevant services in to support those young people as well. So it's about using networks, using partnerships, and how do we kind of manage that level of harm by bringing other experts into into those cases. So we very early on we bring partners in from a multi-agency perspective as well, and this is about bringing value into the experience for the victim, who historically has probably been kept outside sort of any discussions, anything meaningful with regards to the criminal justice system. And I guess for us as a service, we delivered in partnership with Shewan. So what we're able to also look at, Deborah, is people who have been affected by harm, kind of the wider community, wider family, being able to signpost those individuals to additional services, whether that's within Shewan or other partners sort of across the Shewan network, really.
I'm gonna just invite Peter in on this conversation, because he's been probably sitting on his hands and biting his tongue at this, because he's not talking about this in any kinds of abstract way. Obviously he's been that offender as part of the process, so he's just asked me, would you mind if he responded, and I think probably not. So over to you then, Peter.
Mute myself. Let me just, Mr. Keating, in answer to your question, I suppose, really, let me start right at the beginning. I was what was referred to as a career criminal. I've been in and out of prison most of my life, spent 18.5 years in prison, committed every crime you could possibly think of other than murder and sex crimes. So I was quite comfortable in prison. I suppose, thinking back, I was quite institutionalized. And on top of all this, I became a drug addicted alcoholic. That's not justification. I need to add that straight away. That was if that weren't in my life, I would still been a criminal. On March the 6th, 2002, I committed the last crime I was ever to commit, and my initial reaction was, oh great, can't wait to get to Pentonville prison, because the faster I can get to Pentonville prison, the quicker I can get some drugs. And because it was just another place, it was where I grew up, in prison. I got a visit from a then serving police officer who told me that some research was being done on a thing called restorative justice, and if I'm honest, I wasn't the slightest bit interested. I said, oh, that's very good, that's nice. And I walked out. 2 weeks later, this guy come back, and he said, and what he said to me, he said, look, the victim needs answers, and you're the only person who can give the answer. And up until that point, I hadn't really thought about the victim. I've not, you know, because the act of criminality is quite selfish, you know, and if you couple it with addiction and alcoholism, the selfishness goes off the scale. So whether or not I was feeling magnanimous on that day, I don't know. I can make all sorts of flippant remarks about it, but it's not a flippant subject. It's not something that you can that you can take lightly. We're dealing with people. So I agreed to meet with the victims of my crime, and in this process called a restorative justice process, I had no idea what was going on, other than this was the opportunity for the victim to have a voice, to be given that voice. Because in a court of law, usually the victim gets shoved up in the public gallery, might have an impact statement read out, might not, might be able to give some sort of evidence. Usually, majority of cases, people plead guilty, so there's no evidence given, and they might be told what happens afterwards. There's very few restrictions once the court process is finished. You know, in all my life, I was never told I couldn't go into a certain area, and you know, much to my shame, I've got 27 pages of previous convictions. God knows how many that adds up to. But so I agreed to meet with this person, Will, who's, I was talking to him 2 days ago. So we're still really good friends. You know, he's probably become one of my best friends, top 5 friends in the world, sort of thing. And what the process does, what the process really does is, one, it gives. Sorry, I've got a dog driving me mad for biscuits. It gives the victim the voice, and the voice is, why me? Why did you pick on me? Was I a target? Will you come back? Will you do it again? Do you understand how it feels? Do you understand the impact it had on my family? Etc. etc. There's all these things. Now, in a court of law, I would have gone in, pleaded guilty. The judge would have said, you're a bad man, you're going to prison, and that would have been it. That really would have been it. Suddenly, there I am in a room in Pentonville prison with the victims of my crime, and I'm understanding. This is what it's like. You know, all my life I put up these barriers and justifications in my head, and after about 30 minutes of listening to Will, suddenly these barriers vanished, you know. And it was like, I call it the 12-inch transition took place, and it's not, you know, this is nothing other than a 12-inch transition. And suddenly all the barriers went, and it sort of went into my heart. I started to understand. I started to have empathy for this person. I started to understand how much harm I'd caused. And, you know, when you bear in mind how many times I've been in court and how many statements I read, and how, you know, it just, for me, it was an occupational hazard until that day. Until that day when my life, my world completely and utterly changed. To sit in a room with someone you've harmed, who you've harmed a lot, you know, this wasn't just a matter of a burglary. I hit this guy on the head, blah blah blah, and to see this person, 6'5", university oarsman, fit as a fiddle, sitting there crying, turning to his wife, telling her that he was sorry for allowing me into their lives, it was humbling. Would be an understatement. To understand how much pain you cause, oh man, you just can't take that away. Sometime after, I met with Will again, and he was angry. He was an angry man, you know, and he had every right to be angry. I'd broke into his house, I'd hit him on the head with something, and blah blah blah. We met sometime later in Winchester at a conference we were both speaking at, and we talked about that process again, and he told me how that process had freed him from being a victim, you know, because that was the moniker, that was the label he had been given. He had become a victim, and he was due to walk about for the rest of his life being a victim unless something was done about it. And by getting this narrative out, you know, getting this out and telling me how he felt, what he felt, how angry he was, how sad he was, all these feelings, how much shame, because victims, believe it or not, have a lot of shame about the crime. And it freed him up. And here we are, 18 years and a month later, the best of friends, still talking all the time. Whenever I'm in London, I'll go and see Will, and we go to his house. And I remember the first time I'm going to his house for lunch, and it felt very strange to be in the scene of the crime, so to speak. And I said to Will, man, I feel strange. He said, don't worry, old chap, you're invited this time. And you know, we've just remained friends. I'll finish here. What this does, it frees up the victim, and it gives the harmer the understanding of the consequences of their behaviours.
Peter, I just want to say thank you very much on behalf of everyone for sharing that personal story. Lots of thumbs up going on in the group. So open to the group really, in terms of if you want to ask Peter a question, if you want to ask Garry a question. Sue, you're delivering this on the ground if anybody wants to ask Sue a question. But an opportunity really to just sort of, you know, if you haven't spoken already and you want to ask a question, then by all means either use the putting your thumbs up button, raise your hand, or wave, or physically do it, and so I can see you, and I'll come to you in a minute. So, okay, so I've got Ian wants to ask a question, then I'll come back to you, Sue. Is that all right? If I could just let Ian, I'm going to unmute you now so you can ask a question. I think, there you go. Oops. You there?
Really, and thank you, Peter, for that. That was really, really fascinating. I love the idea about it. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me all right?
Yep.
I love the idea about it freeing the victim as well as anything else. A couple of questions though. So we're looking at supporting grassroots organisations who are working to tackle serious youth violence and knife crime in London. And I'm just wondering about the degree to which the restorative justice sessions that you're all familiar with always take place in a formal context, i.e. there has been a referral from one of the statutory agencies somewhere involved, or sometimes does it just happen on a community level where a grassroots organisation who is skilled in this can bring young people together, and together they can sort out some of the issues? That was my first question. The second question was, when you're thinking about the facilitator who's going to work with the victim and the perpetrator, do you always try and find somebody who's relatable to them, i.e. somebody who might be younger, somebody who might be from a BME community, or does that not really matter?
Thank you, Ian. So I'm going to go to Criminal Justice Alliance wants to ask a question. They got their hands raised. Garry, and then to Sue. So I'm going to try, oh no, and then we've got another one over here. So let's go, the first person to put their hand up as you started talking, Ian, was Garry. So I'm just going to, Garry jumping up and down, and then go to Sue, and then I'm going to go to the Criminal Justice Alliance. I think there might be two of you from there on the call, unless my screen's jumping about. So over to you, Garry.
Yeah, I'm going to be trying brief because Peter left that sort of issue around, you know, it frees up the victim. And I would put a strong argument, it frees up the community. It puts justice back into a community setting. And you know, my inspirational journey started in Northern Ireland, and that's the one I take, you know, answering Ian's question, it's the one I take the greatest amount of power from. It doesn't have to be as formal in the way that you've heard there, Ian. You can do group conferencing. You know, if there are problems affecting a community, then, you know, informal group conferencing using restorative practice is just as powerful as a one-to-one part of a criminal justice process. But where you have communities really affected by knife crime, or by antisocial behaviour, or by you know, sexual abuse, etc., then informal restorative conferencing of a group setting can be really helpful in terms of freeing the community back to take charge of its own issues. And for me, using restorative practice in that sort of setting would be absolutely beneficial to the sort of community challenges that you're talking about in that question. So I would say that as well as freeing up the victim, the power for the community of restoring community responsibility is critical through restorative practice. And I'll pass it to someone else because I've had a lot of my say, Sue.
Sue?
Yeah, I guess just picking up on Ian's question, and Garry has kind of sort of explored this. I think it can be done informally, and actually that gives a lot of strength and power to the local community. And what you're doing then is creating a restorative community who then hopefully can address some of these issues before they even get to the point where they're within the criminal justice system. And I guess one of the things you know that could be kind of quite powerful is actually kind of skills development within the community. So identifying certain community leaders who themselves have been either drug dealers or kind of, you know, leading up kind of, you know, heading up these gangs, and actually working with them to develop the skills to have the restorative conversations, use the restorative behaviour and language, and actually that then becomes embedded as part of the DNA within your communities. And that's about then not being done to, which kind of, you know, communities can really kind of kick against. And I guess then I just wanted to have just a quick question to Garry, really. I'm probably one of very few Scousers who gets excited about being with a Cuppa. So I wanted to ask you a question, really, Garry. You know, we work with Devon and Cornwall Police and we've got a very good relationship with them. However, when it comes to addressing, or we've had a referral which involves an emergency worker such as a police officer, we appreciate fully that they're under a lot of pressure. We're playing with timetables around shift patterns, that kind of thing, but we don't really get much buy-in when the police officer themselves have been the victim of the crime.
Yeah. And
how do we get through that? I guess, you know, what any handy tips? Because as a force, positive support for restorative justice, but when it comes to key individuals who've been affected by crime themselves, really difficult to engage that one individual.
I'm going to be trying really be brief, and Sue, I'd love to pick this up outside of this with you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
But I'm just trying to be very brief on that one. One of the biggest mistakes I made on starting the restorative program was actually believing the police officers would buy into it and actually could actually do this process. There's some of the, I'm not saying every police officer, but in the main, the culture and the skills of policing are just incompatible with restorative practice. And that's why we had to start really investing in people like yourselves and volunteers and community members and skilled practitioners to be able to really give this the foothold it needs. Sue and I and Andy in MutualGain work on a weekly basis now with police across the UK, and we're still trying to work hard to give them a cultural outlook. The community justice and community activity is vital in terms of reducing crime. One by one, we can work through these individuals and teams to be able to make a difference. But culturally, it's the one big challenge, and I'd love to pick that up with you, Sue, because there is an opportunity, but there's a real challenge around how do you change that mindset towards restorative practice within an organisation that is so driven towards, in some ways, retribution and reaction, which is what policing is often done. So I think there is a route through, but I haven't got all the answers. But I'd love to have a chat with you later about that.
Yeah, no, happy to, Garry. That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Criminal Justice Alliance wanted to ask a question. If anybody else wants to ask a question, we have got 10 minutes left. So if you want to ask a question, there is a little button along the bottom of your screen somewhere which might show a thumbs up or a raised hand. So if you want to use either of those, it just tells me as a facilitator who's waiting to ask a question on the screen. So over to Criminal Justice Alliance.
Hi, I'm Nina. I'm the director of the Criminal Justice Alliance. Hi, Sue. Sue's on our restorative expert group. I just wanted to pick up a couple of things that we discussed most recently in our restorative expert group. One was about this whole idea about restorative culture and restorative practices, as opposed to just restorative conferencing. And I just wondered whether Garry or PT had seen any examples of how restorative practices are being used in the current situation with COVID, or where they could be used. You know, is there opportunities at this time to kind of take a more restorative approach to policing and to the criminal justice system at this time? And also thinking about there's going to be a big backlog of cases as well in the courts. You know, do you think this is an opportunity for restorative justice to be used more frequently as an out of court disposal at this time? And then my second question is that this afternoon the Justice Select Committee are speaking to the Victims Commissioner about the Victims Code and other things. I just wondered what you think would be some of the game changers on a policy level that would help to really kind of increase the amount of restorative justice and restorative practice. Is it about targets, like the Home Secretary has talked about reintroducing targets? Should there be a target focused on restorative justice, for example? Does there need to be more changes to the Victims Code about access to restorative justice services? What policy things could the Criminal Justice Alliance and others be kind of calling for more loudly to help make this change?
I'm going to try and just answer again briefly as I can. And, you know, I think you know, restoring community conversations and community restorative feelings is something that really could help UK society pick up from this challenge. I don't think there's any great evidence out there that it's at the front of anybody's mindset, but it's certainly that's the work we do in MutualGain, which is trying to understand that collaboration and cooperation is going to help us, you know, survive and get through the rebuilding from this. To go back into a retribution would just be so detrimental to UK society, which over the last few weeks has seen growth in volunteers, people helping each other out. And I think, you know, now's the time to sort of nail a restorative community conversations. So many people who I know are breaking the rules out there. But the moment we click back into normal society, they'll be exactly the same people who follow the Daily Mail sort of pointing the finger at victims. And I think that is the irony of where we are. So some form of restorative conversations in communities would be really helpful. In terms of your conversation with the Victims Commissioner, I'd hate to see targets driving restorative justice. I really would. I mean, that's how we got here in the first place, was to keep away from targets. But, you know, putting something in the victim's charter that says that every victim should be able to understand what restorative practice is and have the opportunity to be able to ask to be part of a restorative program, for me, is the only way forward. We've tried before in the past. It hasn't been overly successful. Not every police and crime commissioner has funded the programs in the way that Sue's have. But now's the time to be able to sort of, you know, try and get the Victims Commissioner on board in relation to that.
Thanks, Garry. Liam, you're going to ask a question, and then we've had a question in the chat about whether training at an early stage would help, because when practitioners are working with police, they're saying similar things to you, Garry, in terms of this isn't how we're trained, it's counterintuitive to the way in which we're trained. So are there any sort of, are you aware of any moves or progress to kind of making this part of an early training package, given we want to change the way policing operates? So that's one question that's come up in the chat, but I want to also allow Liam to ask his question too, because they might conflate and you might be able to answer both of them at the same time. Go on, Liam.
Thank you. So my point was going to relate very much to that. So for those that don't know me, I was an operational frontline police officer for over a decade before I moved into change, and now work in the NHS. And I was lucky enough to work with some senior leaders from the Police and Health Service to develop the National Police and Health Consensus. And this is really counterintuitive to the general culture of police thinking. And that's a real problem that policing has to move forward into the 21st century at the moment, is how officers are trained to think. It's reinforced, but it does attract people that think in black and white, that people that think in right and wrong, that people that see the world as goodies and baddies. And since we've lost our community roots as police, we also now start to see ourselves as removed from communities officers almost. And I have been this police officer. See yourself walking out to a war zone when you leave the Nick, not just returning to your community and being an active part of that. So I think there's a lot of cultural change around policing. I hear a lot of police officers saying mental health is a health issue. It's got health in it. And it's like, well, the person with mental health issues doesn't really care about how you want to classify it. This is a complex problem and it overlaps boundaries. And this is where that type of thought process needs to be removed, and how we actually talk, going back to our previous conversation, how we talk about what is useful data to police officers should be led from the community and what's important to the community. And that's how RJ should be involved. It should be a part of that. Do the community see value in it? Are they getting value from the RJ process? Are the offenders being able to get value from it? Like Peter's story was amazing, and does that allow them to reintegrate back into communities and link in with people? It's all about that wider aspect. My fear is that traditional police thinking it could very easily become a target-led, let's do lots of these, or this is a really quick way to turn an undetected crime to a detected crime, and we're going the wrong way then. It's really, really powerful stuff, but if we can't change that traditional thinking of policing, I think it risks becoming a tick box exercise, which would lose the integrity of it for policing.
Yeah, so you've probably answered Hev's question there, I think, Liam. Thank you. Peter, you've got your hand up to say something there.
Yeah, just a comment around this. Unfortunately, with all the cuts to policing, it's become more and more difficult for the police really to buy into RJ because they're overworked, overstretched, underfunded, etc., etc., etc. Some years ago, 7 years ago, I've done some work with Thames Valley, and it was myself, one police officer and one probation officer, and we was assigned to the integrated offender management team, and we worked for 1 year with the PPOs, prolific and priority offenders, and at the end of that 1 year, using restorative approaches, not conferencing approaches. We did do some conferencing, but I set up office in a cafe. I rented a table, got it away from the officialdom, and within 12 months, we reduced the reoffending rate by 48%. Restorative approaches works.
Brilliant.
I've just come back to Liam. Yeah, just come back to Liam's one. And it's great to have Liam on here because we were speaking yesterday with Liam. But this is your bread and butter, Liam. Because we talked about culture yesterday, and this is back into it. The instant gratification of policing. Sorry to be simplistic and stereotypical, but majority of police officers like simple responses, and charging people and cautioning people is really simple. Engaging with communities is hard. Setting up co-produced problem solving within communities is really hard. And actually getting people to commit and buy into restorative approaches and practices is really hard. And somewhere along the line in policing in the UK, there has to be a cultural change that says actually policing, the whole principle of offending in this country is difficult and complex, and therefore activity has to be difficult and complex too. And we've made life too easy for policing. And I think there's a real opportunity for you and the work that you do to really tackle that and challenge that in terms of get away from a simplistic approach to offending, because simplistic approach to offending will not stop offending. It will not do that. Burglary will continue, car crime will continue, but also rape will continue, domestic abuse will. You really have to find in-depth criminologically based solutions. And restorative justice is one of those to be able to tackle. And so it's great that you're on this call, Liam. Really appreciate your time here today.
So we've got Dave's waiting to ask a question. We've got 2 minutes left. There's a comment that's come up in the chat about there's a lot of police degree apprenticeships going on at the moment. The new move in policing to allow them to do apprenticeships. Is RJ in that apprenticeship curriculum, I don't know. I know that what community engagement is in there certainly isn't the type of community engagement that we would be advocating. So yeah, let's have a look, see if anybody else knows that. Deb, what question did you want to ask?
Very quickly, I wondered if there were any particular police forces in the UK or other countries where this approach and philosophy has penetrated the kind of culture that you've been talking about.
Who wants to answer that? I'm just going to go to, while someone's thinking about answering that. Where's he gone? Ian, I've lost you off my screen now. Oh, maybe he was going. He put his thumbs up and maybe he was leaving then. So, okay. Yeah, he's had to dip out. He's put it in the chat. Who wants to answer that? Any good police forces that have embedded that? I will refrain from making my comment. Anyone else?
I embedded it in two forces in Cheshire, where it worked really well, in Greater Manchester, where it really didn't work well at all. And I think the cultural difference between those two forces was the driving force behind that. Where you have a police force led by people who are committed to building strong communities and who have got the time and patience to be able to come up with co-produced solutions, then you'll find restorative practice works really well. Where you've got an organisation driven by people who are constantly looking for ways of demonstrating their effectiveness, then you will not find commitment to long-term restorative programs. You know, restorative justice has its basis, has its boundaries in, you know, Aboriginal culture, you know, tribal culture, whereby, you know, they would deal with offending through dialogue within communities. And, you know, it's no different. Yes, we're a very advanced society. Yes, you know, criminal justice hurts people and demands that there's a criminal justice solution. But don't forget that the victims need closure, and victims need to be involved, and communities can bring about change better than anybody. So it works across the world, but it really does require significant commitment to be able to get the best out of it, and I'm sure Sue would agree with that as well.
Thanks, Gary. Okay, so it's 1 o'clock, so the Cuppa's over. I've got a comment in the chat to say let's continue this. If any of you would like to continue, if any of you would like to host a virtual Cuppa on the same theme, but you know, maybe a different angle on it, or maybe focus into a bit of detail around it, then we're more than welcome to host one for you. So if you are interested, do just get in touch with me, let me know. I'm just about to do a new schedule today for the next 2 weeks. So if you've got any time over the next 2 weeks to continue this conversation, then let me know. If not, then just let me know in a couple of weeks.
Could I suggest, rather than continue with half of us and half not, could I suggest that we do, you know, put another one in and let's restart this again in a fortnight's time, or, you know, a week's time, and have a look at it again from a different angle, and perhaps we can, you know, look at it from a different approach. But maybe Sue and I could do something jointly together or something. But that would be great. I've really enjoyed this. Really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Okay. So that's a decision then. Sue and Gary are gonna lead the next one on this. Hopefully with a bit of interaction with Peter and Hev, because I think you're all kind of quite live to what's going on. I don't know about the other people on the call, so I don't know much about you, but if you are doing this at the moment, it's part of your everyday practice, or you've got family, friends that are criminals and that you'd like to think about this as an alternative approach to the way they're being treated at the moment, then that voice would be really welcome in this, I think. You know, not just the professional and the practitioners around that, but if you're worried about someone close to you and you want to understand this process better in order to be able to help. It was on that note that I'd really like to perhaps ask Peter to run a session, because I'm aware that, you know, professionally people will know Peter. I haven't been in the RJ world, so I didn't know him, and I know some of my colleagues don't know him. But I think there is a place for Peter to be able to reach out to the wider population and tell his story outside of practitioners. So I did plant that with him before we started. He's going to have a little think about it. And then all I would say to you is, if you do say yes to that, Peter, it'd be really great if every one of us could kind of put our marketing head on to get it out to as many people who might be at risk of entering in the career criminal cycle. That might want to get out of it. If you could shout out to everybody to sort of come and listen to him. No pressure, Peter, but just let me know in due course if you don't mind doing it.
Just as an end to that story, and Peter used to tell me that all he ever wanted in life was a bus. All he ever wanted in life was somebody to give him a bus, and he would drive around the United Kingdom, going town to town, village to village, telling them how they should invest in restorative practice. One of the biggest regrets of my policing career, Peter, was I never got you your bus. And I wish we had. So maybe this is a virtual bus of some description.
Yeah, come on. This can be the virtual bus. Let's take it everywhere then for you. And you don't even have to drive this one, Peter. You know, we've got it set up for you.
Okay, no pressure then.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks so much, everyone. Have a lovely day. Thanks for the cuppa. Hopefully we'll see you again on the next one. Cheers.
Thanks, Gary. That's great. Thank you.
Bye.